Welcome back. Last time we talked about the changes taking place in the 1940s, 1950s. We mentioned the baby boom, the GI Bill, the growth of the suburbs, mass culture, which we talked about, how good is pop culture? Should we always be abiding by pop culture, or should we have a greater, truer, more precise compass to live our lives by? Obviously, the answer is no. We ought to be living by Jesus Christ, by the Word of God and what He has told us. As Christians, that should be our focus. Speaking of Christianity, let's talk about what American religion was like after World War II. During this time period, we see materialism and church growth taking place. Now, this is a paradoxical moment taking place right here, right now. Normally, materialism goes up, church growth goes down. Or church growth goes up, materialism goes down. But in this case, both were increasing during this time period. Materialism diverts people away from God, but in post-war America, church attendance grew for both liberal and evangelical churches. In the 1940s, less than half of Americans belonged to a church. By 1960, that number jumped to 65%. Catholicism grew in acceptance, doubling in size to about 42 million people. So we see materialism and church growth taking place. Maybe the idea was they wanted a belief in God. It didn't matter who God was. They just wanted belief in God, and I have it intentionally lowercased so that to understand that we're not talking about the one and true God, but belief in God to counteract the godless communists. Belief in God or any religion was a good thing to set us apart from the godless communists who were atheistic. In the 1950s, the U.S. added the phrase "under God" to the Pledge of Allegiance, and the phrase "in God we trust" to all currency. In fact, even Hollywood got in on the act by producing religious-themed movies, such as the well-remembered Ten Commandments, which we see at Easter every year, or Ben-Hur. For many Americans, the two ultimate authorities, however, were now science and the individual. Be true to yourself was an axiom of the time. Linked in the practice of psychology, they were also given expression in popular liberal preaching and writing, such as Norman Vincent Peale's book, The Power of Positive Thinking. This time period was a religious time period, but much of this religion remained superficial. Unfortunately, during this time, religion was only skin deep for many people. Question I could ask is, how deep is your quote-unquote religion? Let's move on. Letter B, the fair deal. We might remember Theodore Roosevelt's domestic policy was called the Square Deal, and Franklin Roosevelt's domestic policy was called the New Deal. Well, now we've got the Fair Deal of Harry S. Truman. The Fair Deal included the GI Bill, which we've already talked about, also sought to increase aid to science and public education, and sought to subsidize medical insurance. In other words, free health care. In short, the federal government continued to expand its role in the lives of American citizens. During this time, laborers wanted higher wages, so many of them resorted to strikes to get their way. As the number of strikes grew, some people thought that unions had gained too much power. By the way, the Fair Deal, some of this, as we saw, got approved of. Some of it, like the medical insurance, was rejected. The Republican-controlled Congress passed the Taft-Hartley Act over Truman's veto. Truman actually vetoed it, but Republicans had a supermajority and were able to get it passed anyways, which sought to limit union powers by giving employees more freedoms from unions. For example, it outlawed the closed shop. That was a practice that forced businesses to hire only union members. It also allowed states to prohibit unions from requiring workers to join a union within a certain date of their hiring. The act also said that the unions had to give a 60-day notice before changing or ending work contracts. During that time, they could not go on strike. Another term called injunction. Injunction was a court order forbidding a strike if the strike threatened national health or safety. The injunction lasted 80 days, and during that time, strikers and management had to settle their dispute through negotiation. So they couldn't just go on strike whenever they felt like, whenever they wanted to, immediately. They had to wait at least 80 days according to a court order called an injunction. In 1948, we have an election taking place. Remember, how did Truman become president? Oh yeah, FDR died and Truman was the vice president. But now we have the election in which Truman now has to stand on his own two legs. He has to be reelected by the people. Even Truman seemed very unpopular around this time, and his own party will actually split with him. The Progressive Party, also we'll call them the Liberal Democrats, nominated a man by the name of Henry Wallace. Henry Wallace was FDR's Liberal Secretary of Agriculture. His views were sympathetic toward socialism, so he was an extreme liberal Democrat. Another group of Democrats formed what were called the Dixiecrats. These were conservative Democrats, and they nominated Strom Thurmond. These conservative Southerners disliked Truman because he sought to protect the rights of African Americans. The Dixiecrats ran on a states' rights ticket, so promoting things like segregation and states' rights. The Republican candidate was a man by the name of Thomas Dewey. With Wallace and Thurmond pulling votes from the Democrats, pollsters predicted that Dewey was a sure winner. Guess what? They were wrong. Truman won a surprising victory. Truman waged an exhausting campaign, traveling across America and making speeches from the end of a railroad car. The public apparently admired his fighting spirit. Truman said, "I met the people face to face and they voted for me." In fact, the election had been so close that newspapers had already identified Dewey the winner in the election. As you see the famous photograph that was taken, the Chicago Daily Tribune apparently thought Dewey had won the election. Whoops. And that's Truman holding up the newspaper, mocking the media for that mistake. So Truman wins the election, surprisingly. Letter C, the last thing we'll talk about today is the quest for civil rights. What are civil rights? Well, the definition for it is rights guaranteed by the Constitution to all American citizens. Yet despite the guarantees of the Constitution and the brave service of soldiers in World War II, Black Americans were still denied many of their civil rights. African American struggle for equality became known as the Civil Rights Movement. Congress rejected much of Truman's civil rights legislation, but the president kept trying to reduce the discrimination against Black Americans through the influence of his position. Now, gotta understand, discrimination was not just a Southern thing. It actually also took place in the North. In the South, they were known as the Jim Crow laws. Laws in the South forcing segregation in restaurants, schools, theaters, public transportation, and elsewhere. I don't have time to go into it right now. I wish I did. But I'd like to tell you about, all of the issues that deserved the civil rights. Why did African Americans feel like they needed these rights right away? One example, for example, was that African Americans would buy a home from a white owner, but the white owner would make the law according to a method where if the black owner failed to make a payment on time once, automatically he forfeited his home, and the white owner got full possession of that house again. And what that white owner would then do would he would sell it off to another black individual with the same rules, and then hopefully get that money back for himself, his plan. School segregations, I think we understand that concept. Schools were separated to black and white schools. White schools tended to have wealthier supplies, better paid teachers, better everything, and the poor black schools had fewer items. And then one more illustration I'll give you was a situation involving some white men who killed a black teenager, allegedly for whistling at a white woman. In fact, the person who was killed, his uncle, was an eyewitness of the men removing this teenager from his house and killing him. In fact, by the way, the white men who were put on trial for this murder, they were cleared of all crime. And after the crime had been cleared, these same men openly admitted that they had murdered this teenager, but they got away with it. So, civil rights had to be enacted. Whether by law or practice, these forms of discrimination made it very difficult for black Americans to rise to the middle and upper classes, even during a time of great prosperity. Not only as I said, was it in the South, but it was also in the North. It was known as redlining, a practice in the North to maintain segregation. FDR and Truman provided some early limited support for civil rights. Federal government would not contract with a business that discriminated against minorities. The President's Committee on Civil Rights was created to investigate instances of alleged discrimination. Truman called for an investigation of alleged discrimination in the military. He called for Congress to pass laws against lynching and the poll tax. He called for an end to discrimination by employers and unions alike, and an end to discrimination in public transportation. He ordered a ban on segregation in the armed forces. In fact, Truman became the first president to campaign openly for black votes in Harlem, New York. In the election, Truman got more than 2/3 of the black vote. He lost 3 southern states, but gained Ohio, Illinois, and California, ensuring his reelection. Truman appointed William Hastie, who became the first black federal appeals court judge. This was the highest judicial post held by a black person at that time. Truman also appointed blacks to several high-ranking administrative jobs. For example, Edward Dudley became the first black ambassador of the U.S. In 1947, Jackie Robinson became the first African American to play Major League Baseball. On page 481, there's a pink box entitled Jackie Robinson. I want you to read that pink box to yourself. Once you have finished, please unpause the video and we'll continue. Higher education also began to open up to blacks. The University of Oklahoma admitted blacks to its graduate school in 1948, the first school to do so. The courts will intervene in civil rights as well. The Supreme Court case Plessy v. Ferguson had legalized segregation. For many years, groups sought ways to oppose this ruling. The NAACP was an organization that sought to end inequalities through the courts. It challenged segregation, winning small victories here and there over the decades. But the first real victory occurred in 1954 in a court case called Brown v. Board of Education, in which the Supreme Court ruled that segregation in public schools was illegal. The schools were to integrate with all deliberate speed, but some school districts did not do so until 1969 or later. In Arkansas, where the governor had called in the National Guard to prevent the integration of public school, President Eisenhower, we'll talk about him later, brought in the Army to enforce the law. Number 2, early civil rights protests. In 1955, Rosa Parks was arrested for refusing to give up her seat on a bus. It resulted in the Montgomery bus boycott and the Supreme Court ruling segregation of buses as unconstitutional. On page 482, I want you to read the last 2 paragraphs to yourself. Once you finish, please unpause and we'll resume. Hope you all have a good day. Bye.